Hey, what's up? Just want to thank you guys for watching our channel. Please hit that subscribe button.
We got a bunch of these Jaylen Brown questions after he signed his Supermax extension yesterday. Go through a couple of them real quick. Timmy McDonald from Twitter, Celts Inc. JB long term, which we knew was coming, but is the hefty price considered a bad deal or simply cost of business with the new CBA? Scott Knowles says, how does JB's new deal affect the rest of the league, specifically those players that he's regularly compared to? And does it take more teams out of potentially being able to build a championship contender? Okay, so we can start with those questions. But Tommy, I think I probably speak for both. I wasn't shocked that Jaylen Brown signed a Supermax extension, right? He qualified for it. He's all NBA this season. He's a player who's done a lot in his career. We'll get into that in a second. And he's entering his prime. But you weren't shocked at all that he signed for this.
No, I think there are reasons for it, but the amount of time it took, he was eligible for it on July 1st. The fact that it took a month was probably a little surprising, but him getting it is certainly not shocking.
Yeah. No player option, gets the trade kicker. Sometimes it's those stuff, the things on the margin, especially when you're doing an extension and you're not beholden to the madness of the first 24 to 48 hours of free agency. Sometimes when you do the extensions, it's the little stuff that holds up. I was always under the assumption that they would re-sign him for this number. I want to go through this real quick because I saw some comments yesterday. I think in general, anytime someone signs for the biggest contract in history in any sport, right, there's some sticker shock. I think in Jaylen Brown's case, there's probably even more sticker shock because Jaylen Brown is a fantastic player. He's not a top 5 player, right? He's not a top 10 player. So I think for the casual fan, they're just like, oh, that's insane, right? Jaylen Brown's not worth it. Jaylen Brown's not worth more than so-and-so. Can't believe Jaylen Brown signed for that when so-and-so signed for that. So let's just talk about this because I think so much of contract values specifically in football and basketball and to some baseball, not so much hockey because their union sucks, but everything is just tied to revenue, right? So we have a salary cap in the NBA. All right. It's essentially functions for years as a soft cap with the luxury tax and the exceptions coming up in 2 years, like an apron. It'll essentially function as a hard cap, meaning you can't really go over now. Phoenix Suns said, fuck that. We're going to just go all in and deal with the consequences later. But it's essentially a soft salary cap. Once you have a salary cap, you then have to have a max contract, right? Otherwise, if the salary cap's $100 and you want to go sign LeBron James, you're going to pay him $90. And then you're going to have $10 to fill out your roster. That doesn't really work that way. So for certain players, and I don't think Jaylen Brown's in this category, but for certain players, LeBron James, Steph Curry, those two guys for sure. Michael Jordan, if he were to play in today's NBA, Larry Bird, Dominique Wilkins, like there's certain guys you're like Magic, right? You're just like, if there wasn't a salary cap, these guys are worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the league. That's just the reality, right? Yeah. But there is a cap. And Jaylen Brown, because he qualified with his All-NBA appearance, he's eligible to sign 30%, right? The Supermax. And he did. I go back to Mike Conley's agency, right?
Yeah,
he signed the biggest
bring that up.
history. And it's like sticker shock. It's like, well, so much of free agency, so much of these extensions are all about timing and when you sign for it, right? And it's all tied to revenue. So the salary cap, as long as it's rising, contracts keep going up. In a year, potentially this fall with Giannis, I don't know what his Supermax looks like if he were to sign his extension, but within a year, somebody will blow this number out of the water. Jason Tatum next summer, he's eligible for more money. This will be to happen in the NBA and probably in the NFL as long as revenues keep rising. Every year, this is going to happen.
The question I had, so you mentioned the Conley thing. I was going to bring that up. In 2016, his was 151 mil, and that was the highest. The question I have is about this particular deal, and we've talked a ton about this with this team and these guys on the show, is not that Jaylen Brown doesn't deserve this contract and this money, but does it make sense for this particular team? And obviously they had to do it because even if they are going to move him down the road, it's not like they're going to move him right now. So there wasn't another option in July 2023. But it is, I think for the casual fan looking at this thing, I think even when you know the numbers, you find it interesting that the highest paid player in the NBA is not the best player on his own team, which is the nature of the beast, but is still interesting, and just kind of a weird thing to think about.
Okay, so yeah, a little bit to unpack there because I want to get into the intention of the Supermax in the CBA. But before I do that, I think there's two questions here, right? Does Jaylen Brown deserve more to get more money than Jokic or Giannis or Steph or LeBron, right, in salary? The answer to that is no. Did the Celtics have to re-sign him or sign this extension for the Supermax? The answer to that is yes. They're trying to win a championship. They're our best position to not allow Jaylen Brown to go into free agency. So the answer is yes. Both can be true, right? The intention of the Supermax, I think if you look at really the two biggest probably free agents over this generation that just went into unrestricted free agency were LeBron James in 2010, Kevin Durant in 2016. In both those cases, they were leaving teams that drafted them. In both those cases, they wanted to hit unrestricted free agency. They did not. There was no mechanism to sign this Supermax extension. And so they hit free agency. And what happened? They left Cleveland. They left Golden State. The teams then had to go into, Oklahoma City did it a little differently the next year and qualified for the playoffs, but they had to sort of reset, right? Cleveland, of course, went into a rebuild, ended up getting Kyrie, and LeBron came back. But the point is, they lost them for nothing. So you hear all the time now about pre-agency, right? I think about Kawhi Leonard. I think about Anthony Davis. Those two guys were unwilling to sign these massive extensions. And so a year before they were free agents, they traded them because you can't allow these guys to hit free agency. Then you have the Damian Lillard and the Bradley Beal situation where those guys got their money, right? And we'll deal with potentially being traded later. Got their money. I want to win here, blah, blah, blah. Totally. Maximize your profit. Get that. And I think in some cases, the intention was to keep the Kevin Durants of the world. The intention was to keep the LeBron Jameses of the world, the Nikola Jokic's, the Giannis's, the Steph's, these guys. Keep the homegrown talent, keep the top 5, top 10 players. But because of the mechanism with All NBA and Defensive Player of the Year and all that, MVP, whatever you have, you have guys like Rudy Gobert signing for the Supermax. You have guys like Bradley Beal, Jaylen Brown. These are fantastic players, deserving All NBA guys, deserving All-Stars. I'm not saying that. But they're in a different tier than LeBron James, Steph Curry, Nikola Jokic. So in some ways, the intention was to keep a certain type of player, right? The top 5 needle movers. But because of the qualifications, we're now in a situation where Jaylen Brown just signed the largest contract extension in NBA history. So I think the intention of the deal has not panned out to the reality of the way the Supermax works. Is that fair?
Hey, I think it's fair. And I guess my follow-up to this, and I wanted to get a little bit, I think a couple wrote this in, but I was going to bring it up regardless about Austin's comments. But with the new Austin Rivers comments, but with the new CBA, we've talked about how hard it's going to be to keep these 3 max guys in general. And I thought one of the sort of didn't get as much attention as the Dame stuff, but one of the interesting things that he brought up was like the NBA middle class and how it's basically like you have these max deals and then all these other guys are now playing on minimums or close to minimums who would have, had much more substantial deals before sort of things have changed over the last few years. I think on like a macro level, if teams are in this situation where it's like, okay, you have to pay a guy like Jaylen Brown, he's an all NBA player, you have to give him this thing. Isn't that going to result in, guys that might have been operating in the like whatever 8 to 16 mil range? Are they going to start getting squeezed out more because the money isn't there anymore because we're having to sort of keep up with the Joneses when it comes to these max deals?
Yeah, no, the money is going to be there because the money has to be paid out, right? Each team has to pay 90% of the salary cap. That money has to be paid out. And with the slight alteration in the new CBA, instead of having to pay out 90% of salary by the end of the season, they now have to do it by the start of training camp. So that money is going to be paid out in free agency. I think as you saw this summer, I think there's going to be contenders, and this has been true for a while, but contenders are going to have less and less opportunities to add generational players in free agency because they're in win now mode, the luxury tax, blah, blah, blah. They're just not going to have cap space. And so I think you're going to see, and you've seen this more and more, two things, more and more the non-contenders, Houston Rockets this year, San Antonio Spurs, Indiana Pacers, right? These teams, those are the teams that have space this year. There's like 68 teams with cap space. None of them are contenders, right? And the other part is because of the max extensions and because of the new extension rules too. Like when I was with I'll give you an example. When I was with the Clippers in 2016, that was the summer everybody, went crazy or whatever. And they presented me with an extension and they were like, we're going to give you this extension. We know you're not going to take it because the rules back then, I could only get a raise above a certain amount, right? So I was making call it 7 and change. My extension would have been 3 for 27, essentially. Like they knew I wasn't going to take that number. They said, we're going to offer to you. We know you're not going to take it. And I said, thank you. I appreciate it. And then I hit free agency, right? Now I could have renegotiated on that number. I could have, taken caps. There was a bunch of different ways to get to a decent number and sign an extension. So I think you're seeing that more and more, right? Jordan Clarkson just did it. Harrison Barnes just did it. Sabonis just did it. Like free agency for the most part is dead. And so what you're going to see is not the generational players. You're going to see the Jaylen Brunson. Jaylen Brunson was the best free agent last year. You're going to see more and more of that. And more teams that don't have a chance to win in the near term. Those are the teams with cap space. You build through the draft, you pay the rookie salary cap, you hope to bring in some. Look what Houston did this year. Like that's what you're going to see. That's going to be free agency. And look, if I'm Jaylen Brown, if I'm these guys, I always go back to Kawhi. Like I can't believe Kawhi was in San Antonio. Like Kawhi was in San Antonio. There's no state tax. If he had signed his extension. He went to play in Toronto where he paid a high tax. Now he's paying in California. Like, it's his choice. I'm not knocking his choice. But certain guys would look at that and be like, oh, I'm going to lose 30 or 40 million net in my pocket, post-tax, net, $30 or $40 million.
You're never getting
guys
back.
Don't want to do that. Guys don't want to do that. So, yeah, I do think free agency is, for the most part, dead. It's unrestricted free agency is dead.
But so to that point, if free agency is dead, it's unavoidable, right? That what's going to happen with Dame and what's happened with these other guys over the last couple of years that also was sort of complaining about is going to keep happening because it's not realistic to think that like free agency,
same thing.
Free agency is dead.
I don't want to go to Boston. I don't want to go to Boston. I want to go to LA, right?
Yeah.
Boston
so I mean, what do you think about that though? Because I guess my feeling just as a fan and as an outside observer is like, if free agency is dead, if we've set the system up this way, of course guys are going to ask out. You can't just expect people to stay where they are all the time when the timelines and the situations are not matching up to their personal expectations.
Right. So this is the unintended consequence of the Supermax. This is the unintended consequence. We are leaving you, with a few exceptions, Kawhi, Anthony Davis, we are leaving you no choice but to sign this Supermax, right?
Yeah.
No choice. Well, the league has set it up now where if I go to free agency, I can't sign for the 5th year. I can't get the Supermax. I'm going to lose tens of millions of dollars. Okay, I'll sign it and just hopefully get traded later. So then why can't you, why, I think, look, I don't like that James Harden and Damian Lillard says, I want to go to one team and one team. I don't like that. I don't think it's good for the league. But what's their choice? What is their choice? And the teams are hamstrung. We've talked about this a ton. Like the teams, they've got to operate in what's, in the best judgment of what's best for the franchise. But if there's not a market for players, if there's not a market, like I'm sure there's teams that want Dame and James. I'm not saying that, but you've essentially capped the market to some degree when you say, I just want to go to one, right? Because what happens, Dame's unhappy. What if happens to James? Like it's a shitty situation to be in, but the player essentially has no choice. And I'm not trying to dramatize this. We're like, oh, he's got no choice but to sign for 250 million versus 200 million. No, I'm just saying, like, if you were faced with the same thing at any job, you're going
For sure.
You're not going to turn down that money.
And
you're not
also,
going to turn down.
Also, where I don't have an issue with it. First of all, we can just it's sort of obvious. We can acknowledge, like, these things when they're getting reported out in piecemeal, a lot of stuff gets lost in translation in terms of what is being said and what isn't being said. But I guess where I don't have an issue is, like, James and him, they should both say, like, I want to go here. That's their leverage to say, I want to go here. I think it's up to the teams who control what happens with them. Like look at Kawhi's a good example of this. I don't think Kawhi, could be, remembering wrong. I don't think Kawhi wanted to go to Toronto.
No.
That wasn't, if you would ask him about his personal destination, it wasn't going to be Toronto. But Masai was like, we have a chance to win a championship if we get him. So he went and did it. And I don't think he would regret doing that. And so I think that if there's another team that feels like Dame is going to, put them in that conversation, they should make a swing for it. The idea that, like, everyone else needs to just sort of sit there and not do anything feels a little crazy to me. And it just feels a little, like, melodramatic to blame the player, when the reality is, like, there are two sides to this equation and other people can get involved, and the teams, clearly that's why they're waiting, but I don't know.